The year was 1941. The world was burning, and America stood at the edge of a storm it could no longer ignore. Across the Atlantic, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. Its armies tearing through Europe, its bombers ruling the skies. Factories in Germany worked day and night to produce aircraft, tanks, and weapons at a speed unmatched by any other nation. To the Reich, industry was victory. They believed no democracy could match the discipline, precision, or sheer productivity of their totalitarian empire. They were wrong. Half a world away, in the heart of America's industrial belt, a visionary automaker was preparing to prove it. Henry Ford, the man who had once revolutionized the automobile, was about to revolutionize warfare. His weapon wouldn't be a gun or a tank, but something far more powerful: the assembly line. The same method that had made the Model T a household symbol of progress would now be turned toward the skies, forging the greatest symbol of American industrial might: the B-24 Liberator bomber. A machine of 1.5 million parts, complex, massive, and seemingly impossible to build in numbers large enough to change the war. At a time when the average aircraft factory took weeks to assemble a single plane, Ford dared to imagine building one every hour. It sounded like madness, a fantasy of industrial arrogance. German intelligence laughed at the reports, mocking the Americans for thinking cars and bombers were the same. "They will drown in their own machinery," one Nazi engineer reportedly said. But in Detroit, something extraordinary was happening. The farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, was being transformed into a living monument of innovation: the Willow Run plant, the largest factory under one roof in human history. Inside its vast walls, 40,000 workers, men and women, young and old, black and white, labored in perfect rhythm. Sparks flew from welding torches, conveyor belts hummed, and the air shook with the sound of progress. Piece by piece, the dream became reality. Ford engineers broke down the complexity of the B-24 into thousands of smaller steps, teaching ordinary Americans to build extraordinary machines. The impossible began to happen. The line moved faster, smoother, stronger, until by 1944, a brand new bomber rolled out of the factory doors every 63 minutes. The world had never seen anything like it. The Germans, once confident in their industrial dominance, were stunned. Hitler's engineers could not believe that a democracy, a nation of individuals, had built a system of such perfection. But Ford's army of workers had done what tyranny could not. They had turned freedom into power and production into victory. The bombers of Willow Run would soon fill the skies of Europe, hammering the Axis war machine from above. The year was 1940, and the world trembled beneath the weight of war. Across the Atlantic, the thunder of the Luftwaffe echoed over London skies, and Nazi armor rolled across Europe like an unstoppable tide. In America, the factories of Detroit still gleamed with the promise of prosperity, building cars that symbolized freedom, leisure, and a way of life untouched by the chaos abroad. But that illusion was crumbling fast. Soon, those same factories would awaken from their slumber and forge the weapons of victory: steel giants that would fly farther, strike harder, and reshape the destiny of nations. When Germany invaded Poland, few in the United States truly understood what was coming. Isolationism ran deep. America was weary of foreign wars and wanted no part in another European conflict. But Henry Ford, the industrial titan who had revolutionized the automobile, watched closely. A man of contradictions, visionary and stubborn, idealist and pragmatist, Ford believed in the power of machines to change the world. Yet he despised war, seeing it as a failure of civilization. Still, as the Axis powers marched forward, even Ford realized that neutrality could not last forever. By 1941, the situation was clear. Britain was barely hanging on, and Hitler's bombers seemed to rule the air unchallenged. Factories in Germany turned out Messerschmitts, Junkers, and Heinkels in terrifying numbers. American observers were stunned at the speed and efficiency of Nazi production. Something had to change. The United States needed an industrial miracle, a way to outproduce the enemy so completely that the balance of war would tilt before a single American soldier set foot in Europe. And in the heart of Detroit, the unthinkable began to take shape. It started with a phone call from Washington, a request that seemed impossible. The Army Air Forces needed bombers, thousands of them. The B-24 Liberator, designed by Consolidated Aircraft, was one of the most advanced planes of its time. A massive four-engine beast that could carry 5 tons of bombs across oceans, but it was complex. Over 1.5 million individual parts, more than 300,000 rivets, and dozens of intricate systems that had to work in perfect harmony. Traditionally, one B-24 took weeks to assemble. The military needed hundreds every month. It can't be done, the experts said. But Henry Ford didn't believe in can't. Ford's mind, even in his 70s, burned with ideas. He had already changed the world once with the moving assembly line, turning automobiles from luxury items into tools of everyday life. If he could build a car every minute, why not a bomber every hour? To most, it was insanity. To Ford, it was destiny. He called a meeting at his Dearborn headquarters, summoning his engineers, production managers, and son Edsel Ford, who quietly shared his father's genius but carried a softer heart. There, in a smoky boardroom, the idea that would shock the world was born. A factory that could build an entire B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The news spread through Detroit like wildfire. Skeptics laughed. Aviation was not automobile manufacturing, they said. Aircraft were fragile, precise, and handmade by specialists, not stamped out on conveyor belts. But Ford's team pressed on, confident that the same principles of mass production could conquer the air as they had conquered the road. The plan was to construct a factory larger than anything ever attempted, capable of housing not just machines, but a system, a living, breathing organism of production that could turn raw aluminum into flying fortresses of freedom. That place would be called Willow Run. As construction began in 1941, the farmland west of Detroit transformed into a vision from the future. Bulldozers carved runways through the earth, while cranes lifted the steel skeleton of what would become the world's largest factory under a single roof. It was so vast that workers joked they needed bicycles just to get from one end to the other. The assembly line would stretch nearly a mile long, bending in a great L shape to accommodate the limited space of the airfield. Every bolt, every beam, every design decision was made with one purpose: speed. While the Germans perfected their weapons of war, America perfected the art of making them. Ford's engineers faced daunting challenges. The B-24 was a masterpiece of engineering, but a nightmare for assembly. Its intricate hydraulic systems, gun turrets, and massive Davis wings required levels of precision that had never been attempted on an assembly line. Ford's men tore apart the bombers' blueprints and reimagined them piece by piece, designing jigs, templates, and mechanical assists to simplify every process. The goal was to make bomber construction so efficient that even workers with no aviation experience could assemble one.
That the Americans
It was a
were
triumph
developing a
not
new
of
naval
genius
fighter
alone,
called the Hellcat.
but of organization. Rumor
As the
had it
U.S.
that this
edged
new
closer to
aircraft was
war,
bulky,
tension
heavy,
rippled
and
through
slow,
every factory
a
in
clumsy
Detroit.
beast that would
Pearl
never
Harbor
dance with a
changed
zero.
everything.
In the
The
pilot's
attack
barracks and
ignited a
briefing
fury
tents
that
across
swept across
Rabaul and
America
Truk,
like
laughter
wildfire.
echoed.
Another
Overnight,
flying
isolationism
refrigerator from the
died,
Americans,
and industry
they joked.
awoke.
We'll swat it from
Ford's
the sky
Willow
like
Run
all the
plant,
others.
still under construction,
But behind the
became a
laughter,
symbol of the
deep in the
nation's
factories of
determination.
Long Island,
The
something
auto barns of
extraordinary
Detroit,
was shaping
Ford,
up.
Chrysler, and
Grumman
General
engineers
Motors became
hardened
generals
by the
in their
lessons
own
of
right,
early defeats,
commanding
were
armies
designing
of
not a
welders,
dancer,
machinists,
but a
and
brawler,
riveters.
a plane
Their
that
weapons
could
were
take
not
a hit
rifles,
and keep
but
fighting.
blueprints.
The
not
F-6F
bullets, but
Hellcat was
bolts.
born not from
the new
arrogance,
front line
but
was
from
the
necessity.
assembly line.
Its heart was
By
the
late
roaring Pratt &
1942,
Whitney
Willow Run stood
R2800 engine.
complete.
Its
A steel
skin
city
thick with
dedicated
armor,
to
its
one
teeth,
task,
6 heavy
feeding the
Browning
war
machine
machine.
guns.
Over
It
a
wasn't
mile
elegant,
long,
but it was
powered by
relentless.
thousands of workers
This
and an
was a fighter
unbreakable
built
rhythm.
not to
It was
impress,
unlike
but to
anything the
win.
world had ever seen.
When the Hellcat finally
Reporters
took to
who
the
visited
skies in
were awestruck.
1943,
Conveyor
the
belts
laughter
carried
died.
fuselages the
What
size
began
of houses.
as mockery
Overhead
turned
cranes
into
lifted
terror.
wings into place
Japanese
with the
pilots
grace
who
of
once
dancers.
mocked its size
The air
soon
hummed
learned
with the
that
noise
the
of
Hellcat
compressors,
could dive faster,
drills,
climb
and
higher,
engines,
and
the
most
symphony of
importantly,
victory being
survive their
written
best
in metal.
attacks.
To those
The
who
Predator
worked there,
had
it
become
was
the
not
prey.
just a factory.
Across
it
the
was
Pacific,
hope made
from the
tangible.
Marianas to the Philippines,
In Berlin,
the Hellcat
the
carved
German
its
High
legend,
Command began
rewriting
receiving
the
intelligence
rules of air
reports
combat.
that sounded like
It
fantasy.
became known as the
Ford
Ace
Motor
Maker,
Company
a
building
machine
bombers
that turned
by the
ordinary
hour,
men
one
into
file
legends,
read.
and broke the
Claims
back of
exaggerated,
Japan's once
but
invincible
the
Air
truth was
Force.
worse than they imagined.
This is the story of the
For every
aircraft
day
that
the
rose
Reich
from
spent
defeat
repairing
to
its
dominate the
factories,
skies.
Ford's
The story
machines
of the
rolled
F-6F
another
Hellcat,
B-24 out the
the
door.
beast that
America's
silenced the
entry
laughter
into
forever.
the war had
In the
unleashed
spring of
a power no
1943,
nation
the
had ever
endless
faced.
blue over the
The
Pacific
industrial
shimmered with
giant,
sunlight
now
and
fully
arrogance.
awake.
Thousands
And as
of
the
miles
first
from their
Willow Run
homeland,
liberators
Japanese
took to the air,
naval aviators
streaking across
still
the
ruled
Michigan
the
sky,
skies.
the
Their
message was
Mitsubishi
clear.
A6M0,
The world's sleeping giant
light,
had opened
nimble,
its eyes.
and almost
The
mythic,
war machine had
humiliated
awakened,
every
and the
Allied
countdown
plane
to
it met
Germany's
during
shock
the first 18
had
months
already
of the war.
begun.
From
When
the
the
Philippines
architects
to
of
the
war
Indian
spoke
Ocean,
of armies,
it seemed
they thought
that
of
no
men
American
and weapons.
or British design
But in
could
America,
match its
the
turn
generals
radius
of
or
industry
climb.
dreamed of machines that could build faster than any army could destroy. For Henry Ford, that dream was both a challenge and a calling. He had already conquered the automobile, taken the privilege of the wealthy, and made it the possession of the common man. The moving assembly line, the crown jewel of his genius, had changed the very rhythm of the modern world. Now, standing at the dawn of America's entry into World War II, Ford faced the greatest test of his life. Could he bring the same miracle of mass production to the skies of war? The B-24 Liberator was no Model T. Where a car had a few thousand parts, the bomber was a labyrinth of 1.5 million components, a machine of monstrous complexity. Each wing contained the strength of a bridge, each engine the power of a locomotive. Building one was more like crafting a cathedral than stamping a product. Yet Ford believed that what could be dreamed could be built, and what could be built could be multiplied. His vision wasn't just to produce airplanes, it was to revolutionize the very idea of aircraft manufacturing. Inside his Dearborn office, Ford spoke with quiet certainty. "We're not going to build planes the way they've always been built," he told his engineers. "We're going to build them the way we build everything else, in motion." He envisioned an endless flow of aluminum, steel, and labor, a symphony of movement that would end, every hour, with a new bomber rolling out the door. The word seemed impossible. Aviation experts laughed, aircraft builders scoffed, but Ford's confidence was infectious. His chief production engineer, Charles Sorensen, later recalled that moment. He spoke as though the machines were already humming. Sorensen, known as Cast Iron Charlie for his unshakable resolve, became the architect of Ford's dream. He had helped design the first automotive assembly lines decades earlier. Now he would scale that philosophy to the heavens.
With chalk and blueprints spread across drafting tables, Sorensen began sketching what would become the largest factory on Earth, a place where bomber construction would no longer be an art, but an exact science. He named it Willow Run. But even dreams demand logic. The team needed to solve 1,000 problems before a single rivet could be set. Airframes, engines, electrical systems, hydraulics all required new processes. Standard airplane factories of the day built planes in small sections, slowly, by hand. Skilled craftsmen moved from station to station, shaping aluminum like sculptors. Sorensen's plan replaced artistry with automation. Subassemblies would be built on parallel lines, merged into fuselages that crawled forward inch by inch until wings were attached, engines installed, and the bomber, a machine heavier than hope itself, rolled out. The idea of such a system staggered the imagination. Even the Army Air Forces hesitated. "You'll never get airplanes out of an automobile factory," one officer warned, but Ford's team countered with numbers. If each station could produce a component every few minutes, and if workers could be trained to handle small tasks repetitively, the combined rhythm would yield a finished bomber every 63 minutes. It wasn't magic, it was mathematics, and mathematics, Ford liked to say, never loses faith. Money poured in. Government contracts worth hundreds of millions transformed the once quiet farmland of Ypsilanti, Michigan, into a hive of construction. Trainloads of materials arrived daily: steel beams, concrete, glass, and the lifeblood of modern industry, aluminum. At the same time, a new workforce emerged from every corner of America. Men too old for combat, women eager to serve, farmers, mechanics, and school teachers all answered the call. They would learn to drill, weld, rivet, and wire. They would become the hands of the dream. Yet the dream met friction. Aircraft manufacturers viewed Ford's plan with contempt. The Consolidated Aircraft Company, original builders of the B-24, warned that mass production would compromise quality. They believed airplanes were too delicate, too intricate for conveyor belts. Ford's engineers disagreed. They argued that precision could be built into the tools themselves, that jigs, templates, and gauges could enforce accuracy better than human skill ever could. Slowly, the blueprint of a new kind of factory, part laboratory, part cathedral, took shape. Henry Ford's stubbornness became both his curse and his genius. He clashed with generals, argued with bureaucrats, and refused to accept delays. "If we can build a bomber a day, we can win this war. If we can build one an hour, we can finish it sooner." He saw production not as logistics, but as warfare itself. Every minute saved on the assembly line was a bullet fired at tyranny. The Germans, watching from afar, dismissed such ambition as absurd. Their intelligence reports spoke of a car company attempting to build heavy bombers. In their arrogance, they underestimated what American industry could become when fully awakened. Hitler's engineers still relied on handcrafted perfection, believing craftsmanship equaled superiority. Ford was building something different, a system that could overwhelm perfection with sheer scale. As 1942 dawned, the foundations of Willow Run began to rise. Concrete poured by the ton, walls climbed toward the clouds, and the skeleton of the world's most audacious dream took shape. The plant stretched across 3.5 million square feet, its roof so vast that weather systems seemed to form above it. Inside, cranes swung like steel giants, lifting machinery that gleamed beneath floodlights. Visitors compared it to a city, a living organism powered by electricity, sweat, and faith in the impossible. Ford walked the site often, his gray eyes reflecting both exhaustion and triumph. "The Germans think they're efficient," he told Sorensen one afternoon as sparks rained from welding torches. "Wait until they see what freedom can build." The words would prove prophetic. When the first skeleton frames of the B-24 arrived to be placed on the line, workers cheered. They weren't soldiers, but they felt like warriors in overalls. Each bolt tightened, each rivet driven, was a blow struck for liberty. The dream of mass production was no longer a fantasy. It was breathing, thundering, alive. In that moment, something greater than machinery was born at Willow Run. It was faith. Faith that intellect, cooperation, and purpose could outmatch tyranny. In the months to come, that faith would be tested, refined, and proven on a scale no one in history had dared imagine.
It began as a sketch on a sheet of paper, a rectangle so immense that it seemed almost absurd. "Here," said Charles Sorensen, dragging his pencil across the blueprint, "is where we'll build the greatest factory in the world." Around him stood a handful of engineers, architects, and Army Air Forces representatives, their brows furrowed in disbelief. The plan for Willow Run looked less like a factory and more like an empire, 1 mile long, half a mile wide, and dedicated entirely to the creation of a single machine, the B-24 Liberator. Yet, in the chaos of global war, absurdity had become the mother of invention. In the winter of 1941, as the first steel beams began to rise from the muddy fields outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, America's industrial heartland pulsed with feverish energy. Trains arrived daily, stacked with concrete, girders, and electrical cable. The air was filled with the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the rumble of bulldozers carving a new landscape from farmland. The workers who gathered at the site understood that they weren't merely constructing a building, they were forging a symbol of defiance. To the Germans who prided themselves on engineering prowess, the idea that the Americans could mass-produce something as intricate as a 4-engine bomber was laughable. Their factories still depended on highly skilled craftsmen, men who fitted each piece of metal by hand, guided by experience and pride. Ford was about to change that forever. The assembly line, his greatest gift to industry, would now conquer the air itself. But Willow Run wasn't just another production facility. It was a leap of faith on a national scale. The government had placed a staggering $200 million contract in Ford's hands, an investment in both machinery and imagination. No one had ever tried to build airplanes this way, and no one but Ford would have dared. Henry Ford himself visited the site almost daily in those early months, often arriving before dawn. He would walk the unfinished corridors, tracing his fingers along the cold steel frames, as if sensing the energy that would soon flow through them. He was 78 years old, but his vision burned with the intensity of a man half that age. When reporters asked why he insisted on building a factory of such magnitude, Ford's answer was simple: because the world has never needed anything like it before. Sorensen and his team faced problems that seemed endless. The floor plan alone was a logistical nightmare. The building was so vast that early drafts couldn't fit on a single sheet of paper. Engineers had to split the design into sections, aligning them by compass bearings rather than rulers. Ventilation had to be reimagined. Standard factory fans couldn't circulate air through such an immense space. To move heavy parts efficiently, Sorensen designed an overhead conveyor system that ran for miles, carrying wings, engines, and fuselages from one end of the building to the other. It became a symbol of Ford's genius: pragmatic, flexible, and unafraid of unconventional solutions. By the time the roof went on, Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a city under glass. It housed its own power plant, cafeterias, hospitals, and even a fire department.
The population inside its walls swelled to over 40,000. Engineers, welders, clerks, and laborers working in shifts around the clock. Many were women who had never worked outside the home before. Dressed in overalls and scarves, they learned to drill rivets, wire engines, and test hydraulic lines. They became the living rhythm of the machine. Everywhere signs of transformation could be seen. Conveyor belts hummed, forklifts darted between aisles, and giant jigs, towering steel skeletons that held bomber sections in perfect alignment, filled the space like mechanical cathedrals. At night, the plant glowed from within, a beacon visible for miles across the Michigan countryside. Drivers passing on the nearby roads would slow down, staring at the impossible sight of a building so large it seemed to merge with the horizon. But for all its grandeur, Willow Run's early days were far from smooth. When the first B-24 fuselage sections arrived from San Diego, they didn't fit Ford's jigs. The tolerances were off by fractions of an inch, but in aviation, fractions meant failure. The aircraft that had been designed for hand-fitting refused to cooperate with the precision of mass production. Sorensen refused to panic. Instead, he tore apart the blueprints and began redesigning the assembly process from scratch. If the airplane won't fit the line, then the line will fit the airplane. Weeks turned into months of trial and error. Thousands of man-hours were spent adjusting tools, calibrating machinery, and teaching workers how to work in rhythm. At first, the progress was painfully slow, a handful of planes a month. Critics whispered that Ford had overreached, that the dream of a bomber an hour was just propaganda. But Sorensen pushed harder. He demanded discipline, precision, and patience. The line will move, and when it does, nothing on earth will stop it. By the spring of 1943, the rhythm began to emerge. Subassemblies flowed like clockwork. Workers on the floor moved with practiced grace, each performing a single task in perfect sequence. Entire sections of fuselages rolled down the line on massive jigs, joining with wings, engines, and tail assemblies. The process that had once taken weeks now took hours. The first completed bomber emerged from the hangar doors to a chorus of cheers. On its nose, someone had painted the words, "Spirit of Willow Run." When the first wave of B-24s roared into the sky above Michigan, their engines echoing like thunder, the world took notice. Reporters called it a miracle of modern industry. Military observers called it the turning point of the war. German intelligence officers reading the reports dismissed them as exaggeration until reconnaissance photos confirmed the truth. A factory the size of a city was indeed producing heavy bombers faster than the Reich could shoot them down. Inside Germany, disbelief turned to alarm. Their war machine, once the marvel of the modern world, was now being outpaced by an assembly line. Hitler's ministers demanded answers. How could a nation that once built automobiles now outproduce entire empires? No one had an answer. The Industrial Revolution that Ford had begun decades earlier had found its ultimate expression and its ultimate weapon in Willow Run. The gigantic factory was no longer a dream. It was alive, roaring, relentless. Its heartbeat was measured not in seconds, but in bombers. Each hour brought forth another engine of liberation, another symbol of American resolve. By 1944, the heartbeat of American industry thundered loud enough to shake the world. At Willow Run, the once dreamlike promise of producing a bomber every hour had hardened into a living, breathing reality. What had begun as a sketch on Henry Ford's desk now stood as one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements, an assembly line so vast and efficient that it defied imagination. Every 63 minutes, without fail, a fully armed B-24 Liberator, a 1.5 million part miracle of aluminum and firepower, rolled out of the factory's giant doors and into history. For the men and women who worked there, the sight never grew old. Each new aircraft gleamed under the fluorescent lights as workers swarmed over it for final checks. Its wings polished to a mirror sheen stretched wider than a tennis court. Its engines growled like lions in chains, ready for release. And when the ground crew rolled it toward the runway, the roar of its takeoff reverberated through the plant, a physical reminder that their labor had taken flight. It had not come easily. The first year of production at Willow Run had been a chaotic symphony of mistakes. Machines jammed, tools broke, workers fumbled through new techniques. Ford's engineers had to reinvent almost every step of the process to match the precision aviation demanded. But the genius of Ford's philosophy, divide, simplify, repeat, began to work its magic. Once every worker understood their role in the rhythm, the factory came alive. The line moved, and America's dream of mechanical might found its perfect tempo. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Its night shift was a world unto itself, glowing under red safety lights, echoing with the sound of drills and the distant hum of conveyor belts. Coffee steamed in tin mugs, radios played swing music over the din of machinery. Welders, riveters, and inspectors worked side by side in a harmony of motion. At its peak, Willow Run employed more than 40,000 people. Nearly half were women. Housewives who had never touched a wrench became mechanics. Teachers, waitresses, and students learned to assemble wings and engines with flawless precision. "We weren't soldiers," one woman later said, "but we fought our war with tools." Efficiency was religion. The bomber's parts, more than 1.5 million of them, arrived by rail from all corners of the country. Engines from Buick, instruments from Bendix, tires from Goodyear. Trains rumbled into Willow Run's private yards at dawn, unloaded their cargo, and rolled out before the sun had climbed above the smokestacks. Every component had its place. Every minute had its price. Ford's timekeepers monitored the line like surgeons, measuring a heartbeat. If one station lagged, the entire rhythm faltered, and the line had to pulse perfectly to meet the sacred 63-minute target. By summer of 1944, the system ran with uncanny precision. Each bomber began as a skeleton, a naked frame of aluminum, and moved steadily down the line, gaining form and strength like a living creature. Workers attached wings and engines in synchronized teams, their movements practiced until they looked choreographed. Electric motors drove conveyors forward by inches, never stopping, never reversing. At the end of the line, inspectors signed off with chalk marks, and a Liberator rolled into daylight, its shadow sweeping across the tarmac. Every 63 minutes, another steel bird took to the sky. Reporters who toured Willow Run could hardly describe what they saw. "It is a city that builds flight," one journalist wrote. Another said, "You could stand at one end of the line, light a cigarette, and before it burned out, a new bomber would emerge." The spectacle became a morale symbol across America. Posters proclaimed, "The Yanks build one every hour." The photographs of endless ranks of B-24s lined wing to wing filled magazines, proof that industrial democracy could do what dictatorships could not. Across the ocean, German intelligence analysts refused to believe it. They studied reconnaissance photos showing endless rows of planes parked at airfields in England and Italy, and they calculated the impossible. Their own factories, even under forced labor, could not produce fighters at such speed. Their reports to Berlin grew frantic. Enemy aircraft production exceeds expectations by orders of magnitude. To them, it was sorcery, a fusion of machine and manpower beyond comprehension. In truth, it was the triumph of coordination, discipline, and will. The effects were felt on the battlefield almost immediately. The new waves of B-24s flooded Allied squadrons in Europe. They bombed oil refineries in Ploiesti, supply depots in France, and shipyards along the Baltic coast. German soldiers looked up and saw skies dark with the products of Willow Run, silver swarms that filled the horizon. They came like clouds, one German anti-aircraft gunner recalled. We could shoot until our barrels melted, and still they came. At home, every completed bomber carried a piece of its maker's pride. Workers wrote their names inside fuselages, tucked photos of loved ones behind panels, or painted small messages on the landing gear doors. "Give 'em hell, boys," or "From Detroit with love." The factory's rhythm became America's heartbeat. Newspapers printed the statistics weekly, another 100, another 200 planes delivered. To a nation fighting on two fronts, those numbers meant life, progress, and hope. Yet behind the triumph lay exhaustion. The men and women of Willow Run worked through nights, holidays, and illness. The noise was relentless, the heat unbearable in summer, the cold bone-deep in winter, but few complained. "Every hour we rest," one supervisor said, "the boys on the front lose air cover." And so the line moved, through blackouts, snowstorms, and even mechanical failures, as though powered by something more than engines. By the war's end, the Willow Run plant had produced over 8,600 bombers. Each one required 1.5 million parts, 313,000 rivets, and 485,000 feet of wiring. Each one rolled off the line exactly 63 minutes after the last. The mathematics of victory had been proven. For the Germans, it was a revelation wrapped in defeat. They had mocked the American obsession with mass production, calling it crude and mechanical. But the war had shown that numbers were not mere abstractions, they were power. Ford's factory, humming with 40,000 hearts and 1,000,000 moving parts, had built not just airplanes, but the future of warfare itself. When peace finally came, the great assembly line slowed, then stopped. The last bomber rolled into the sunlight, its polished skin reflecting the faces of tired workers who cheered and wept at once. The line that had never slept went quiet, but the echo of its rhythm, that steady, unstoppable 63-minute heartbeat, continued to resonate around the world. By 1944, the words "Arsenal of Democracy" were no longer a slogan on a government poster. They were a living truth, forged in steel, sweat, and noise. The transformation of the United States from a peacetime nation into the greatest war machine in history had become complete, and nowhere did that transformation roar louder than at Willow Run. The factory had grown into something beyond comprehension, an industrial organism with veins of conveyor belts, arteries of rail lines, and a heart that beat once every 63 minutes, delivering a new bomber into the world. And across the oceans, those bombers carried not just bombs, but the message that democracy had learned how to fight with machines. At dawn, the sky over Michigan often glowed orange from the fires of progress. The sound of engines testing on the runway rolled over the countryside like distant thunder. Thousands of workers, men and women in greasy overalls, their faces lit by sparks, streamed into the factory before sunrise. Inside, the air shimmered with heat and motion. Sparks rained from welders, compressors hissed, drills screamed, and the air smelled of oil and determination. On the walls hung giant banners printed with Roosevelt's words, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." For the men and women of Willow Run, those words weren't a speech, they were a creed. Each liberator that left the line carried the strength of nations within its frame. Its engines built by Ford and Buick, its tires from Goodyear, its instruments from Bendix, its guns from Browning. Every factory in America seemed to hum in unison, feeding Willow Run's endless hunger for parts. A bomber built in Michigan might include aluminum from Ohio, copper from Arizona, glass from Pennsylvania, and bolts from Chicago. It was a symphony of industry, tens of thousands of separate hands crafting a single instrument of war. It was proof that democracy could coordinate chaos, that free people could outbuild any empire of fear. The bombers that emerged from Willow Run joined vast armadas that filled the skies of Europe and the Pacific. In England, airfields overflowed with their gleaming forms, long silver wings stretching to the horizon. Pilots, many barely out of their teens, ran their hands along the smooth fuselages and felt the craftsmanship of a nation. They knew that somewhere back home, a worker had riveted this skin, another had wired this engine, and someone else, maybe a housewife or a farmer's daughter, had checked the fuel lines before it ever left the ground. Every plane was a connection between the front lines and the home front, between battle and belief. For the Germans, the shock was visceral. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could not match the flood of American bombers now darkening the skies. They watched in disbelief as waves of liberators, escorted by Mustangs and Thunderbolts, poured across Europe in numbers too great to count. "There are more planes in the sky than stars," one German civilian wrote in his diary during the 1944 bombing campaign. The once confident engineers of the Reich, the men who had laughed at Ford's early efforts, now spoke of Willow Run with awe and dread. Hitler's ministers demanded answers, but none could explain how a single factory could produce more bombers in a month than Germany could in a year. The secret, of course, was not secrecy at all. It was organization. Ford's engineers had turned complexity into rhythm. The B-24 was one of the most sophisticated bombers ever built, with over 1 million parts, yet it moved down the assembly line with the same predictability as a Model T. Workers performed single, precise tasks again and again until their hands became extensions of the machine. Riveters worked in pairs, one inside the fuselage, one outside, trading rhythmic knocks that became the soundtrack of the war. Inspectors checked tolerances to thousandths of an inch. Every piece fit, every line flowed. It was not perfection, it was mastery through motion. The human cost, however, was immense. The workers of Willow Run lived at the edge of exhaustion. Many traveled hours each day from overcrowded temporary housing projects hastily built near the factory. They worked through illness, through grief, through the relentless grind of 12-hour shifts. But they believed in the mission. "We were fighting our own kind of battle," one woman recalled. "Every bolt we turned meant another plane to protect our boys." The cafeteria lines were long, the nights endless, but morale was unbreakable. They called themselves the production soldiers, and they wore their fatigue like medals. The impact rippled across the world. In North Africa, the same bombers that had rolled out of Willow Run shattered German supply lines. Over Italy, they crushed rail yards and bridges. In France, they softened the defenses for D-Day. By the time the Allies reached Germany, Ford's bombers had pounded the Reich's industrial heart into dust. To the Nazi generals, who had once prided themselves on precision engineering, it was an unbearable irony. They had been defeated not by superior machines, but by more of them, by the relentless rhythm of a free people who built faster than tyranny could destroy. At home, President Roosevelt took note. When he visited Detroit, he called Willow Run a symbol of what the American people can accomplish when they stand together. The newspapers ran photos of endless bomber lines with captions like "America's Wings of Freedom." To a weary public, those images meant hope, tangible proof that progress was being made, that victory was being built not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and hands of ordinary citizens. And yet, for all the pride and glory, there was something deeply human about the place. The laughter between shifts, the friendships forged over coffee breaks, the songs sung over the roar of engines. Willow Run was more than metal. It was community. Workers shared stories of loved ones overseas. pinned letters from soldiers on bulletin boards and celebrated each new aircraft as if it were a newborn child. For many, it was their first job, their first sense of purpose. When that plane took off, we felt like a part of us went with it, one mechanic said years later. By the end of 1944, the arsenal of democracy had done its work. The Allies owned the skies, and the German war machine was breaking apart. Factories lay in ruins, fuel supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. Meanwhile, the steady pulse of Willow Run continued, minute by minute, hour by hour, as if powered by something greater than engines, by conviction itself. What Ford and his workers had created went beyond machines or methods. It was a new philosophy of strength, that freedom, when disciplined and united, could outbuild any tyranny. It was proof that democracy did not mean disorganization, that individuality could coexist with precision, and that human will, when given tools, could rival the power of any army. The factory floor had become the front line, and the production line had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. And as the bombers thundered eastward, carrying the hopes of millions, one truth became undeniable. America's power did not lie only in its soldiers or its weapons. It lay in its people, in the men and women who turned wrenches, tightened bolts, and made history every 63 minutes. The arsenal of democracy was not just a place, it was a heartbeat, one that would echo long after the war was won.
Long before the steel and aluminum of Willow Run could come to life, there had to be hands, ordinary hands, to shape it. Behind every bomber that thundered down the runway stood thousands of Americans whose names history rarely remembers. They were the human gears inside Henry Ford's mechanical miracle, and together they transformed a cold idea of mass production into the warm, relentless pulse of a nation at war. They came from everywhere. Farmers from the Midwest who had watched their crops wither during the Depression, housewives who had never worked outside their kitchens, teenagers too young for the draft, men too old for the front. They arrived at the factory gates with lunch pails, nervous smiles, and the same thought running through every mind: I can help win this war. Inside, the scale of the place took their breath away. Miles of conveyors, the echo of hammers, the hiss of torches. The first day was always the hardest. Within a week, calluses formed, and the rhythm of Willow Run became as familiar as a heartbeat. Training programs sprang up overnight. Mechanics taught welding to mothers of 3. College students learned to read blueprints by lantern light after their shifts. Instructors drilled precision into every movement: measure twice, rivet once. Errors meant danger later: an oil leak, a cracked wing spar, a life lost at 30,000 feet. Everyone understood that the stakes were measured not in dollars, but in sons and brothers flying above Europe. Quality was not a rule, it was a prayer. Women formed nearly half the workforce. The newspapers called them Rosies, but on the line they were welders, electricians, and inspectors, indistinguishable from their male counterparts, except for the bandanas tied over their hair. They learned quickly, often outperforming the men who had doubted them. A steady hand makes a safe plane, one supervisor remarked as he watched a young woman guide a rivet gun down the curve of a wing. The myth that women couldn't handle machinery died quietly under the fluorescent lights of Willow Run. To keep the line moving day and night, the factory became a city that never slept. Cafeterias served 24-hour meals, coffee so strong it could strip paint, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, stew ladled from endless pots. Loudspeakers played swing music during long shifts, and laughter sometimes echoed between the noise of drills. There were fights, romances, marriages, and heartbreaks. Pay envelopes disappeared quickly into war bonds or family bills. For many, it was the first steady income they had ever earned. For others, it was the first taste of belonging.
Fatigue was the common enemy. 12-hour shifts, bent backs, and blurred vision. The air was thick with heat in summer, cold enough to numb fingers in winter. Yet few complained. "Our boys don't get to stop when they're tired," a foreman reminded his crew. The words became mantra. Workers took pride in the grease on their clothes, in the ring of metal on metal that meant another bomber was closer to flight. Every rivet, every bolt, every wire carried a sense of personal ownership. "That's my plane up there," they would say when the Liberators passed overhead on test flights. Outside the factory walls, life revolved around its schedule. Entire towns grew up overnight to house the workers, rows of prefabricated homes, schools, and corner stores. Families adjusted to odd hours. Children learned to sleep through the distant hum of engines. The local trains ran on the factory's timetable, their whistles marking shift changes rather than dawn or dusk. The rhythms of war had replaced the rhythms of nature. Diversity flourished in ways that surprised everyone. Black and white workers, immigrants and natives, men and women, all labored side by side. Prejudice didn't vanish, but necessity blurred boundaries. The line cared only about speed and precision. It demanded unity. A misaligned bolt could doom an entire crew over the Atlantic. A missed connection could cost hours. Slowly, respect replaced suspicion. "When you're holding a wing steady, you don't ask who's on the other end," one worker said. "You just hold." The management understood morale as much as mechanics. They organized dances in the cafeteria, film screenings of newsreels, and visits from celebrities who thanked the workers for their service. The days were long, but hope stayed alive. Each payday, a Liberty Bell sounded through the loudspeakers, followed by Roosevelt's recorded voice reminding them what they fought for. Even exhaustion became a badge of honor. "Sleep later," read a sign above the exit doors. "Right now, they need you." And they did. Pilots overseas began sending letters back to Willow Run. "Your bomber brought us home," wrote one crew after surviving a flak-riddled mission over Germany. "Tell the lady who built the wing she saved 6 lives today." The messages were pinned to bulletin boards near the time clocks, smudged by fingerprints, read by thousands. They gave the tired hands new strength. By 1945, the people at Willow Run had built not just planes, but a legacy of possibility. They had proved that ordinary citizens could become a force greater than any army. When the war finally ended, many wept as the line slowed and the lights dimmed. They had lived through something vast and irrepeatable, a chapter of history where grease-stained uniforms were as vital as combat ones. The machines they built would fade, but the pride in their labor would not. For decades afterward, veterans of the factory would meet in reunion halls and trade stories about the nights when the floor shook with engines and the air smelled of oil and victory. They would talk about friends lost to time, about laughter that once filled the giant hangars, about the feeling of watching a bomber lift into the sky knowing their hands had made it possible. "We were just people," one woman said, gray hair tucked under a cap still marked with soot, "but for a little while, we were history itself." When the war finally ended, silence descended upon Willow Run. The constant hum of engines, the metallic heartbeat that had pulsed for years without rest, faded into stillness. The enormous hangars that had once glowed day and night now stood quiet, their floors gleaming and empty. For the first time since 1942, the air no longer smelled of oil and aluminum. It smelled of peace. The factory that had once built a bomber every 63 minutes had done its duty, and in doing so had changed the very idea of what a free nation could achieve. Across the oceans, the results of that achievement lay written in the sky. The bombers of Willow Run had flown through every major campaign in Europe and the Pacific. They had carried paratroopers into Normandy, shattered German supply lines in France, and pounded the oil fields that kept Hitler's war machine alive. The industrial might of the United States, embodied in every rivet of every liberator, had proven decisive. The Allies had not simply outfought the Axis, they had outbuilt them. But the victory was not Ford's alone. It belonged to the thousands of anonymous workers who had sweated through sleepless nights, to the engineers who had turned dreams into blueprints, and to the women who had held the factory together when the men went to war. Their triumph was measured not only in aircraft, but in faith. Faith that democracy, when armed with purpose and cooperation, could move mountains of steel. They had turned production into patriotism. When the surrender came in 1945, the celebrations were mixed with melancholy. Workers hugged and wept as the last B-24 rolled down the line, its silver body glinting like a mirror. On its nose, someone painted the words, "Peacemaker." It was both an ending and a beginning. The great factory, once the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy, began its slow transformation. Some machines were dismantled, others repurposed for peacetime work. Soon the same halls that had once built bombers would begin producing automobiles again. But something fundamental had changed. The spirit that had built the skies could not be unlearned. Historians would later call Willow Run the birth of the modern manufacturing era. Its lessons, streamlined production, interchangeable parts, worker specialization, would ripple through every industry on Earth. The factory became a model for efficiency studies from Detroit to Tokyo. Engineers who had honed their craft there went on to design the assembly plants that would power post-war prosperity. In that sense, every car that rolled off an American production line after 1945 carried a trace of Willow Run's DNA. For Henry Ford, the victory was bittersweet. He had proven that his assembly line philosophy could reach beyond the road and into the sky, but the cost had been immense. His health declined, his son Edsel had died during the war, and the empire he built was slowly passing to new hands. Yet when he visited Willow Run after VJ Day, the old man smiled faintly. "This," he said, "is what machines are for, to serve peace after they've served victory." His words echoed through the empty hangars like a benediction. The Germans, once so confident in their engineering superiority, studied the aftermath with astonishment. Captured officers toured American factories after the war and admitted their disbelief. "We thought we understood industry, but you Americans built a civilization around it." They realized too late that the real weapon of the Allies had not been the B-24, the Sherman tank, or the Jeep, but mass production itself. The Iron Cross had fallen before the Iron Eagle. In the decades that followed, the legend of Willow Run became part of American folklore. Veterans who had flown the B-24s spoke of the plant with reverence, calling it the factory that won the war. Workers told their children stories of the long shifts, the noise, the pride of seeing a new plane roll out each hour. Museums preserved fragments of the assembly line, bits of metal that once carried the weight of destiny. The plant itself continued to evolve, building cars, engines, and even aircraft components again during the Cold War. But the spirit of its wartime glory never truly faded. What lingered most was the lesson that democracy's true strength lies not in uniformity, but in unity. Willow Run had been a tapestry of difference. Men and women, black and white, rich and poor, all moving toward a single purpose. It was living proof that freedom could organize itself without tyranny, that order could emerge from cooperation rather than fear. The Nazis had boasted that democracy was weak because it lacked discipline. Willow Run answered them in rivets and wings, discipline born of choice, not coercion. Even now, the echoes remain. On certain summer days, when the wind crosses the old airfield, visitors swear they can still hear the distant hum of engines, the faint clatter of tools, the laughter of workers taking their break by the runway. The hangars may be quiet, but the ghosts of progress still linger in the dust and steel. They whisper of a time when ordinary people built something extraordinary, when faith in a common cause turned factory workers into legends. The legacy of the Iron Eagle endures not in the bombers that once darkened Europe's skies, but in the confidence it left behind, the belief that humanity can unite to accomplish the impossible. It is a reminder that even in an age of destruction, creation can be the greatest weapon of all. The factory may have fallen silent, but the idea it embodied still flies, that the true strength of a nation is not its armies, but its makers. And so when the last worker left Willow Run and turned off the lights, the world did not dim. It shone brighter, powered by the memory of what free hands and determined hearts can build. The Iron Eagle had flown its final mission, but its wings would cast a shadow of inspiration for generations to come.